welcome back historian and author Ramchandra Guha in the second part of our Deep Talk interview series. Thank you, Ram, for joining us. Just a few days before India turned 66, our central government has decided to give the nod to the 29th state, Telangana. And that has predictably set in motion a chain of debates and reactions across the country. Soon after independence, India's states had been reorganized on the basis of language, but in the recent decades, the story has changed considerably. Where are the Indian states headed, and what does that augur for the idea of India as a nation? That's what we are going to discuss with Mr. Guha today. So Ram, I shall start with a bit of history. You have been a supporter of the division of states on linguistic basis, in the sense that you have said that that was an effective solution for the challenges and problems of those times. Now, when you look back through a historian's lens, when do you see, at what point, that the language consideration, started to fail as a sustainable or a sufficient basis for statehood?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is that India is a young experiment, a young political experiment. It's 65 years young. So compared to Western nations like UK or France or the United States, we're still finding our way. We're also much larger and much more diverse than European countries that set the template for nation building and nation making. So we have to evolve our own paths in our own way. Linguistic states was a particular Indian innovation because most European countries were constituted on the basis of a single language for the whole country. But because our languages have different scripts, each of our major languages has robust and ancient literary traditions, Gandhi promised linguistic states. And so that promise, after a long struggle, was finally delivered in 1956. Now the question, even when linguistic states were mandated by the States Reorganization Commission, questions were raised about Telangana. Telangana had reservations about joining a larger Andhra state because they had a peculiar history stemming from the fact that they were under the Nizam's dominion, they were didn't have a coastline, they were relatively backward and all of that. So also with UP, at that stage there was a note to the States Reorganization Commission which suggested UP be broken up into 3 or 4 parts even there. So it was, linguistic states were a response to the situation of the time, as I said. They certainly worked because unlike Sri Lanka and Pakistan, where there were bloody civil wars on the question of language, we were able to avert that. Now, the question is, the next stage of Indian nationhood unity, how should we break up our territories? Now, the first thing to remember about linguistic states is, people who oppose linguistic states fear that if you create linguistic states, this will lead to the balkanization of the country. And if you create a state for Telugu speakers, the Telugu speakers will demand a nation of their own. But that didn't happen. In fact, linguistic states furthered the unity of the country. Now, we need not fear about the unity of the country. So we can think about further division. But this division must be done on a rational basis. I think the problem with Telangana, and we can discuss this, is that it's been done ad hoc. The first redrawing of the map was done on the basis of a commission with 3 acknowledged experts. So I think again there should have been a commission of a similar kind which could have dispassionately examined many alternatives and then gone about it.
So when since you mentioned a commission, if today there were to be a second states reorganization commission, who do you think should ideally comprise that, and what would be the primary debates or considerations before them?
The first one, let's go back to the first one. The first one had 3 non-political people. It had a judge, a historian and a social worker. Yes. Alright. Now I think historians are not needed anymore because at that stage you needed to inquire into the antiquity of demand for Andhra or Karnataka and all that. What are the historic linguistic zones. Now that doesn't. So it's you need an economist to look at whether these states are economically viable. You need probably a jurist or political scientist and possibly a social activist with his or her close to the ground. At the first SRC had all non-political people. Now unfortunately what's happened now is over the last 15 or 20 years, most commissions are headed by politicians, except when they deal with economics, like the Finance Commission. In our original conception, governors of states were also supposed to be non-political. Now that's completely gone. So I don't want to recommend who should be the members. That's what I said. An economist, a jurist, a social worker. You can think of, Ella Bhatt as a social worker, Jean Drèze as an economist, some whatever, Justice Sri Krishna as a jurist. I'm just saying, you can have various names. Now, this present government promised a States Reorganization Commission in 2004. That was the basis on which it had an alliance with the TRS for those elections. Once they came to power, they needed the support of the left. Because the left in that Lok Sabha had nearly 70 seats, the CPI and the CPM. And the CPM was dead against the creation of Gorkhaland. So that's the logic as to why they were too scared to appoint SRC then. And they took it on an ad hoc basis. Now, it may not be too late to appoint an SRC. We have 2.5 times the population of America, but many fewer states. America has 50 states, we have 28. I mean, England has so many counties, I'm not sure, but England has, I think, 35 or 40 counties, right? And England is less than 100 million people. So I think most states, smaller states, generally are likely to provide more focused governance. But the logic of how to divide them, where to divide them, when to divide them, is something that should be decided by experts, not on an arbitrary basis where, either it should not be decided on the basis of just pressure by popular movements to succumb, or you have a right to the next election, the government in power can have the next election, grants, as has happened with Telangana.
Right. So, in the way that concessions have been made to Telangana, you see that ad hoc logic creeping in, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think that's what the first SRC did. They looked at many demands. Now, again, could have had a second SRC. It could look at Gorkhaland, could have looked at Vidarbha. It could have looked at the logic of dividing UP into several states, how that goes. Now, in 2003, new states were created. That is Uttarakhand, Jharkhand, and Chhattisgarh. And Chhattisgarh and Uttarakhand are certainly better off for having separated. Jharkhand is more problematic because there's a very complex of political factors at work. There's a mining mafia, there's Naxalism, and all kinds of issues have not been sorted out. But the best example of small states working is the breakup of Punjab in 1966 into Himachal, Punjab and Haryana. And all three states have done extremely well economically after the breakup. One was a Sikh state, one was a largely Hindu state, and one was a hill state. So there was a kind of an ethnic, ecological logic to that breakup, and it worked extremely well. So I think we should not be worried about India having 40 states. Likewise, in the northeast, in the 70s, Assam was broken up and Meghalaya was created and so on, and that has kind of worked out fine. So I think generally I'm in favor of smaller states.
So you think the demand for Bodoland and the demand for Gorkhaland that will now accentuate, already there, and now with the concession to Telangana, the fact that it will accentuate, you would support a logical solution to all of that based on a larger...
No, I think we should look at discussion. I think each case by case, is it large enough, is it viable enough, does it have the economic resources, where should the capital be, where should the boundaries be drawn, if there are disputed areas, how do you resolve the disputes? It's supposed to be each of these has to be carefully thought through. And this has been rushed because Telangana is much larger than Gorkhaland or Bodoland. It sends many more MPs to parliament. And this is clearly, the creation of Telangana is clearly based on the Congress's calculation that they're not doing well in the run-up to the next general election. And all the MPs they can get will help them. So it's clearly a cynical, opportunistic, political. It still may be the right thing. There's still a logic for Telangana. But the way it's been done, I think, is rather unfortunate.
So in most cases, we are seeing that it's more a question of giving in to the popular movements and political considerations, of course. And following Telangana, we already see quite a bit of unrest, especially in the east, in Gorkhaland and Bodoland.
Yeah.
So, do you see that as a threat to what's happening in the country, to the development of the country?
Well, it's not a threat to the idea of India, it's not to the Indian. These are not issues that should get us excessively worried. It's not as if India is going to break up, India is going to balkanize. We are quite comfortable having containing all kinds of diversity within one territorial unit. How to work it out also, as I said, we are a young experiment. We will evolve, and there will be friction, there will be conflict. There's already been friction and conflict in the first phase of state making in the linguistic states movement. Some of it is unresolved. For example, the question of Belgaum between Maharashtra and Karnataka is still unresolved. The question of whether Biharis have equal rights to Maharashtrians in Bombay is so I think the important thing to recognize about India is because it's such a large, diverse, complex, and as I've called it, the most reckless political experiment in human history. It can never be conflict-free. The question is to moderate these conflicts, to make it manageable. They don't get out of hand. And I think as with linguistic states, smaller states are also not going to go out of hand. Indians should be reminded, those Indians who get absolutely paranoid and fearful when there's a strike, say Darjeeling Hills are closed for 3 days, Osmania University is closed and buses are burning in Hyderabad, and you get doom and gloom, and that's the end of the IT miracle, and that's the end of the Indian growth dream, and all kind of stuff. I think we should be reminded that the USA became independent in 1776. 90 years later, they fought a bloody civil war in which more than 10 million people died before they could decide on the rights of slaves and what kind of federal structure they needed. So I think nation building is a complicated process. It's a tortuous process. It is written with tension, suspicion, conflict, and that's how it's been all over the world. And India will be no different. And it's actually quite striking, given our size, our complexity, and our poverty, how little conflict and bloodshed there has been on the question of nation building. I mean, if you compare it. Of course I mourn every life, killed in police firing in Gorkhaland or in Telangana or in Bodoland or in Manipur or whatever. But overall, I think one should not be depressed by it. I mean, it's a natural logic of reconciling diversity with unity. There will be these kind of hiccups and interruptions.
So let's go to the individual leaders.
Yeah.
For the Telangana side, you've got KCR, you've got Subhash Desai on the other side. What is your sense of individual leaders themselves and how much of a role they seem to play in the actual creation politics? Are they as powerful as you would say? I mean, historians will look back 50 years later and say these are the people who really made these states happen, or do you think this is a flow of politics that was going to happen anyway?
It's going to happen in the leaders' channel. There is genuine popular resentment. There's popular resentment in the Darjeeling Hills about the patronizing attitude of the Plains Bengali. It is also true in some of the other areas like Kuch Bihar, which are more Bengali speaking. These are not Nepali speaking. Certainly there. In Telangana, there was kind of an informal agreement that the chief minister would kind of alternate. That's not happened. The more powerful politicians have always been from coastal Andhra. So there's a sense of discontent. There's also the question of size. Can you have UP, for example? I think Mayawati is eminently sensible, and she said it should be broken up into 4 or 5 units. Can you have 200 million people, which is larger, much larger than Germany, or almost twice the population of Germany, in one state? So there's also the question of size. The remoteness of this capital in a very large state, the remoteness of the capital from distant areas and so on. So there are many issues at work which I think mandate the logic for smaller states, and leaders or individuals charismatically will capitalize on this. I mean, even if Subhash Desai had never existed, there would have been a Gorkhaland. I mean, the Telangana struggle goes back to the 60s. I mean, in the 50s, there was a compromise with the States Organization Commission, then there was some kind of informal agreement with the Telangana leaders and the Simandhra leaders. In 69, there was the first really major Telangana movement, which said we have been betrayed and our promises have not been kept. And it was a massive popular protest. I remember I was a schoolboy. I was traveling by train from Delhi to Bangalore via the Telangana areas. I remember railway station being burnt. Our train was stopped. We were kept in a siding for 8 or 9 hours before the decision. That was the strength of the protest. I mean, it was a major popular protest led by students again. 69, like now, was led by students, largely. So I think there is this sentiment which is real. In the case of Gorkhaland, Bodoland and Telangana, it is real popular sentiment. In the case of Vidarbha, it is a sense of discrimination by Western Maharashtra. It hasn't really led to a major popular movement. In the case of UP, the question of administrative logic and optimum governance. Can you have such a large state? So I think a variety of issues, different issues work in these different cases.
I recently read a report which, since you mentioned Vidarbha, it had a very interesting observation. It said that, now that even within the proponents for Vidarbha, the group which is arguing for a separate Vidarbha state, there is now a second layer of debate on what is going to be the primary language, whether it's going to be Hindi or Marathi. So there it's like, from language we come down to economics or sociology, and from there again back to language. So where does that stop?
That's very interesting. I mean, that's very interesting because in the case of Telangana, it will be Telugu. You know, it will be like UP and MP both speak Hindi. Telangana and Sima Andhra will both speak Telugu. That's clear. In the case of Gorkhaland also, it will be Nepali. You know, Nepali will be the language, and people, I'm sure, in their homes, the privacy of their homes, those who prefer to speak Bangla or Santali or Hindi can speak it, or even in the street. You know, many of our cities are also multilingual in the street. Bangalore is multilingual in the streets. Bangalore is capital of Kannada speaking state. But in some parts of Bangalore, traditionally in the east, you know, Tamil was the lingua franca. In some parts, Urdu or Dakhani may be the lingua franca. So, you know, you can, but the official language of Gorkhaland clearly will be Nepali. The official language of Telangana will be Telugu. If UP is broken up into 4 states, into whatever Pulu said, Bundelkhand and Harit Pradesh, it will be Hindi all around, right? In Jharkhand and Bihar, it's both Hindi. Chhattisgarh and Madhya Pradesh is both Hindi. Uttarakhand and UP, it's Hindi. Vidarbha is a peculiar case because it's kind of in the borderland between the old central provinces and Maharashtra. So the areas that are Hindi speaking, the areas that are Marathi speaking, but my sense is there will probably still be Marathi speaking. And Hindi, you know, the thing about, I don't think this youth is likely to be a major conflict for the reason that in most of, even Western Maharashtra, you know, people speak Marathi and Hindi. They're quite comfortable with that. So it may not be a major flashpoint, is my sense.
So, you know what intrigues me is that isn't there always going to be a basis for a further division? That's what my question is.
Well, I think it's an evolving experiment. I mean, where we went from, you know, in British times, we had, if you leave out the princely states, we had the 3 great presidencies, which were Bengal, Madhya Pradesh, and Bengal, Madras, and Bombay. Then you had the central provinces, the United Provinces, the Punjab, and then you had some smaller units. Bihar and Orissa and Bihar was created out of Bengal. So you have 8 or 9 major provinces. And that was clearly not feasible, and also the logic was not a colonial logic. It made no sense. So we went from 8 or 9 to 28 or now 29. If you go to 40 or 45, it's okay. I think we'll find the equivalent in maybe 50 or 100 years from now. We'll find an equivalent, but. Again, I like to underline, we're a large, complex and youthful political experiment. So, you know, this is the nature of things that you have these roadblocks, these hiccups, these conflicts. And so long as they not lead to the civil wars of the American kind, where 8 or 10 million people die, you know, and they leave scars that are carry on for generations and generations. I don't think. So, as a historian, I'm rather detached about it. I don't see this as a serious problem. I mean, there are many other serious problems in India of governance, corruption, administration, crime, violence against women, and so on and so forth. But going from 28 to 40 states is something we can manage without much problem.
So on this, on the 3 examples of 2000, you said Uttarakhand and Chhattisgarh have actually probably justified the creation of states itself. Can you actually explain that a little bit more? I mean, to the average person who's now been to Uttarakhand without even knowing that, you know, this wasn't the state earlier, what do you think has changed for them?
Well, the change has been slow, but there's a sense that our capital is closer. There's a sense that we were suppressed. There's a clear sense in Uttarakhand. Uttarakhand actually is I grew up in Uttarakhand, so I have a sense of Uttarakhand. In Uttarakhand, there's a clear sense that the hill people are discriminated from other places. We're very far in Lucknow, they don't care for us. And they regard us as, you know, Pahadis, which is, you know, hill people or backward, and likewise the Bengalis and the residents of Darjeeling Hills. So we have our own government now. So that's why there was a major popular movement in Uttarakhand, right? But that's one thing. So you have your own people. So smaller states are necessary but not a sufficient condition of governance. You may still have corrupt politicians who disgust you or sectarian conflicts which you are worried about, you know. But I think on the whole, if you ask most Uttarakhandis today, do you want to rejoin with UP? They'll say no. In Chhattisgarh, you've had much better welfare administration because it's a smaller state. So things like the PDS scheme, for example, were much better in Chhattisgarh than in MP because you may have had a particular politician like Raman Singh who is focused on the PDS. So he's made it his program. And again, the scale is such that you can manage it. So I think, likewise, I mean, to go back a little further back, Haryana, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, again, 3 states created out of 1 province and all functioning reasonably well. I'm not saying that they will solve all the problems of the citizens. You know, you will still have an issue of corruption, access to public services, environmental degradation, poverty. Those will continue regardless of whether you have large or small states. But on the whole, I think smaller states, the experience of smaller states, with the exception of Jharkhand, has been that people feel a greater connect to those who rule them.
is it possible that smaller states will give the citizens a better hopes to fix even these corruption and all these other
In theory,
problems?
yes. When we're talking about political decentralization, we should not ever lose sight about empowering panchayats and municipalities. That is very important. That should go along with the creation of smaller states, and that has not happened. Except in a few places like Kerala, proper financial devolution to panchayats and municipalities is not taking place. I mean, the 73rd and 74th Amendment, you had all these provisions, but to enable those provisions, the state government has to act. And Bangalore wants devolution of power from Delhi to Bangalore. But Bangalore has to also then devolve power to Davangere and to Dharwad and so on, right? And that is where there's an issue. That real Panchayati Raj has not been tried except in a few states. In Karnataka, it was tried under Ramakrishna Hende's government in the 1980s quite successfully. But when the Congress came back to power, they kind of took back much of that. And they restored the powers to the DM and the MLA, which were then under Janata government, the powers that were with the Mandal Panchayat, the Taluk Panchayat, were then taken back. So I think we have to think through many of these issues, but in theory what you say is right, that the problems of corruption, malgovernance and so on, in theory it's easier to tackle them if the seat of power is closer to you than if it is very far away.
So I'm going to go back to history a bit. You have profiled 19 leaders in your book, Makers of Modern India. How do you think there is any one leader among them who would really staunchly support a second reorganization of states based on newer considerations, socio-economic, political, not linguistic?
I think Ambedkar, yes, because I think Ambedkar had wrote about it also. And he wrote in an essay of 1955 called Thoughts of Linguistic States that the principle of a state should be one state, one language, not one language, one state. Meaning, within the state you speak one language, but you can have two Marathi speaking states, or you can have two state Telugu speaking states. So one state, one language, not one language, one state. So he understood even then this distinction, and of course he's Maharashtrian. So he was talking about isolated implicitly of Maharashtra, and likewise with Andhra Pradesh. So I think Ambedkar was of course very interested in federalism. He had a legal training and an economic training. I think among all these leaders, probably he would have understood the logic most of all. Possibly also Rajagopalachari, but I think certainly Ambedkar, because he had his training in economics and federalism, I think he would have understood it. And this formulation, we need one state, one language, not one language, one state. Means that you can divide UP into 5. So you can divide Maharashtra into 2, you can divide Karnataka into 2 tomorrow. Each of which is Kannada speaking, North Karnataka and South Karnataka, whatever you want to call it, right? Bombay Karnataka and my old Mysore, whatever you want to call it. So I think Ambedkar, in his writings, there is a clue that he did not rule out the further division of states.
So it was not as if, the linguistic reorganization was the final word.
No, I think it was a reaction to the events of the time. It was an improvised reaction to the events of the time, which worked for the next 20, 30 years. And then slowly, more states started being created. So, and it was an incremental process. In 1956, some states were created. That is, Karnataka was created, Andhra was created, Kerala was created, Tamil Nadu was created, Orissa was sort of consolidated. But then you had still a fight over Bombay. So only in 1960 were Maharashtra and Gujarat created. Only in 1966 were Punjab, Haryana and Himachal formally constituted 3 states. And only in the 1970s did Meghalaya break away from Assam. So even if you look at the whole process, it's been slowly evolving. It's not as if it's 1956 and 2013. Between 1956 and 2013, various new states have been created. Mizoram was created under the Accord of 1986. Mizoram was just a union territory. So I think slowly all these things are happening. And we'll reach our equilibrium at somewhere between 40 and 50 states, and we shouldn't be too worried about it.
So was there anyone in the same list of 19 people? Was there anyone who was a staunch opponent of any further breaking up beyond the...
Well, at that stage, both Nehru and Rajagopalachari early on were opposed to the creation of Andhra. Nehru, because of his fear as what had happened with partition, that don't forget that the Congress had always stood for a united India. And the dream of united India was, wrecked by the creation of Pakistan. So Nehru feared that since religion had formed the basis for separation, language may also form the basis. So he had that fear. So he didn't really understand that linguistic diversity and nationality were perfectly compatible. He didn't really understand that very clearly. Rajagopalachari was sentimentally attached to an undivided Madras, because that was really, after all, he was Chief Minister of Madras, so he was opposed to Andhra for those reasons. But both then became reconciled. Once the SRC was constituted in 1956, both Nehru and Rajagopalachari saw clearly that this is the way forward, and they gave up their opposition. But this further reorganization that Prabhas talked about, and that we are now witnessing with the creation of Telangana and the movements in Bodoland and Gorkhaland, I think only Ambedkar had a clue that this was possible. With that formulation, one state, one language, which does not mean one language, one state.
So I'm just going to pick up a quote from the epilogue to your book India After Gandhi, where you quoted historian Michael Howard. And I think he said, no nation could be born without war. No self-conscious community could establish itself as a new and independent actor on the world scene without an armed conflict or the threat of one. And then you go on to discuss how the movement for India's freedom has largely been an exception to what he feared. But with increasingly divisive calls that we hear from various parts of the country, do you ever fear that Howard's assertion might come to bear upon the formation of states or the fragmentation of India?
I don't think so. I think Howard's formulation is based on the European experience. I mean, if you're a historian of Europe and you didn't read beyond Europe, and you thought what happened in Europe would set the template for everywhere else. But I think India faces multiple problems. I am not one to underestimate the problems we face as a nation, as a democracy, as a society. But I think war is not something which defines us. And enmity with another nation is not something that defines us. I mean, there are some people, of course, who would like to define India as anti-Pakistan. That's the essential definition of India. Pakistan is defined largely as anti-India. And that's the set definition of Pakistan. That's why it was created, to separate outer India. And among the Pakistani elite, the military elite, and even large section of the political elite, their whole self-definition is we are against India, we are not India. Now, that is mirrored to some extent in some of the jingoistic TV channels, in Delhi. But by and large, no. I think we recognize that our self-definition is something else. It's to do with our own attempts to reconcile diversity with unity, our ongoing struggle to overcome historic inequalities, discrimination against Dalits, women, our sleazeless struggle, not always successful, to maintain peace between our major religious communities, and so on and so forth. So we recognize that the Indian idea, the Indian experiment, is not about war, it's not about conquering other territories, it's not about defeating another nation. That doesn't mean we don't need a good army, a robust air force, and a vigilant navy to protect our borders. Of course, we need all that. But I think the European experience, which is that you're born out of war, France, the collective national memory of France is wars against Britain and wars against Germany. The collective national memory of Poland is wars against Germany, wars against Russia. That's how it was historically. So Howard is reacting to that kind of thing. But I think in India that's not the case. And though some people would like us to define ourselves as anti-Pakistan above all, I think that's an impoverished definition of India. And most Indians don't buy it.
And what about the secessionist movements within India? You hear of the Naga movement and the Kashmir issue.
So those are real issues, those are alive issues, particularly I would say Kashmir. Because Nagaland at the moment seems somewhat recessive. There's been a ceasefire in operation for 15-16 days. It doesn't work perfectly, but at least there's no armed struggle and no conflict, no villagers caught in the crossfire between the Indian army and the insurgents. Manipur is a more complicated case. Lots of insurgent groups, but no clear secessionist movement. Kashmir remains an alive, complicated issue, very fragile. It's a dispute in India and Pakistan. It's not easy to see it being resolved in the next 30 or 40 years. It will require very focused, far-sighted statesmanship in Delhi. It will require a bipartisan collaboration with the BJP and the Congress. Whoever is in power must cooperate with the opposition party to, move forward on Kashmir. So Kashmir is a complicated issue, and that will certainly take time. But I think on the whole, I said, viewed comparatively, I think the Indian experiment of national unity, national unity with diversity, is doing reasonably okay. But that does not mean to say, on the other hand, the Indian experiment with eliminating poverty, creating an inclusive and fair society, creating impartial and transparent systems of administration, those don't seem to be working very well. I think that's where. But we shouldn't fear about the unity of India, we shouldn't fear about Indians becoming jingoistic. That by and large not.